The morning mist over the Rhine Valley drifted through the trees, clinging to the water like something alive. Sergeant Alex Drobick of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion stopped so suddenly that the man behind him nearly collided with his pack. No one spoke. They simply stared across 300 meters of dark water at something that should not have existed. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was still standing. For weeks, every bridge the Germans abandoned had vanished in fire and collapsing steel. The Allies had watched crossing after crossing disappear as the Wehrmacht retreated pontoons. Rail spans, stone viaducts, all obliterated to slow the American advance. Commanders had spent days preparing for what came next: a forced river crossing, the most dangerous operation since Normandy. Engineers had staged boats along the western bank. Artillery crews had plotted coordinates. Medical units had prepared for casualties that would number in the thousands. Then came Remagen. Through drifting smoke, the blackened towers still clung to both riverbanks. The deck sagged. Concrete chunks were missing. Scorch marks streaked the western tower where German engineers had tried to detonate their charges, yet the bridge refused to fall. On the far bank, a few desperate German soldiers scrambled to wire a second set of explosives. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, 22 years old and commanding Company A, spotted the bridge at the same instant Drobick did. All morning they had advanced expecting another crater, another delay. Instead, fate had delivered the impossible, a gateway straight into Germany. Timmermann's voice came out steady despite his trembling hands. "Get on that bridge. Move." Every instinct screamed this was madness. Machine gun nests lined both banks, perfectly positioned to sweep the bridge's length. On the eastern heights, the dark silhouettes of 88mm guns weighted weapons that could turn the deck into a killing ground with a single shot. The Ludendorff itself groaned under its wounds, looking ready to collapse from damage already inflicted. But hesitation meant watching the bridge vanish in flames. This was their moment, or it was nothing. Drobick didn't wait. He sprinted forward, boots hammering against wooden planks laid across steel decking. Company A followed in scattered groups, instinctively spreading out to avoid clustered targets. Every man knew that if the bridge collapsed, there would be no rescue from the Rhine's cold current below. Halfway across, the Germans opened fire. Machine gun bursts tore the air, sparking off girders. Men dropped flat behind stonework. One soldier took a round in the chest and pitched over the railing, his body swallowed by the river. Another shot through the thigh, crawled forward anyway, dragging himself toward the eastern shore. Drobick spotted German engineers sprinting toward the central demolition chamber. He fired and missed, fired again. The engineers vanished inside the tower. Any second now, the entire structure might erupt. Any second they might be thrown into freezing water, crushed by collapsing beams. Still Drobick ran. The engineers burst from the opposite side of the tower, racing away. The explosion never came. Whether the wiring was faulty, the charges damp, or the setup botched in German desperation, the demolition failed. The bridge shuddered beneath Drobick's feet, but held. At 4 in the afternoon, Sergeant Alex Drobick stepped onto the eastern bank, the first American soldier to cross the Rhine on an intact bridge. Within minutes, more troops reached the far side. Within an hour, hundreds. By nightfall, more than 8,000 American soldiers had poured across while engineers coaxed the first tanks over the trembling structure. The news rocketed up the chain of command. Timmermen to battalion, battalion to regiment, regiment to division, division to corps, corps to First Army headquarters. General Courtney Hodges read the report and immediately understood its meaning. A crack had opened in Germany's final defensive barrier. From Hodges, the news traveled to General Omar Bradley, from Bradley to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, from SHAEF to Eisenhower, across the Atlantic to Roosevelt, and finally into the dim hallways of the Reich Chancellery. By midnight, Adolf Hitler knew. The Führer stood in the underground complex beneath the Chancellery Gardens, increasingly isolated from the world above. The Eastern Front had collapsed. The Red Army was grinding through Poland, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. In the west, American, British, and Canadian forces had pushed through the Rhineland village by village, but the Rhine itself had remained a barrier. Every crossing destroyed, every span blown into rubble until now. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, was present when Hitler received the report. Decades later, he would recall the moment with something approaching horror. Hitler took the page in his hands, his face drained of color, then flushed dark. His fingers began to shake, not the subtle tremor of illness, but a violent spasm of rage. He lurched to his feet so hard his chair toppled backward onto marble. For several seconds he could not speak. A strangled noise escaped his throat, half scream, half gasp. Then the words came in an explosion. How has this happened? He hammered the table with both fists. Who allowed this? Why hadn't the bridge been destroyed? Where were the officers responsible? The generals and staff who had weathered 5 brutal years of war stood rigidly silent. There was no excuse that would survive Hitler's fury. The truth was simple and humiliating. The bridge had been prepared for demolition. Charges had been set. But the American advance through the hills west of Remagen came faster than anyone predicted. The officer in charge of the final detonation hesitated, wanting to give German troops time to escape across the span before destroying it. When he finally ordered the explosion, the primary charge malfunctioned. A backup detonation only damaged the structure, leaving it standing. By the time the Germans attempted to salvage the situation, American infantry were already on the deck. Hitler demanded names. They were given: Major Hans Geller, responsible for demolition; Captain Willy Brach, commander of bridge defense; Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters; Major Herbert Strobel. Hitler ordered their immediate arrest, court-martial, and execution. But first, the bridge must be destroyed. Within hours, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, newly commanding German forces in the west, received the order. Destroy the bridge. Erase the bridgehead. Throw the invaders back across the Rhine. Use everything available. Kesselring studied the map spread across his field table and knew the truth before speaking it. The order bordered on fantasy. He had barely 24 operational tanks in the entire sector. Fuel had dwindled to fumes. Ammunition stocks were dangerously low. Wehrmacht infantry divisions had been reduced to scattered battalions of older men. Teenagers and convalescents pressed back into service. The Luftwaffe could barely scrape together a handful of aircraft. Meanwhile, Americans were pouring across the bridge, their bridgehead already 3 kilometers deep and widening every hour. But orders were orders. Kesselring assembled what he could salvage: tanks, infantry companies, scattered artillery pieces. On March 8th, this scratch force hurled itself at American lines and failed. The next day they attacked again and failed again. Each hour, American reinforcements crossed faster than the Germans could organize counterattacks. Hitler, enraged, ordered V-2 rockets fired at the bridge. 11 rockets launched from the Netherlands and roared across the sky. Not a single one struck the target. The V-2 was a terror weapon, fast and unstoppable but hopelessly inaccurate. Designed to obliterate city districts, not a single span of steel and stone. The rockets slammed into Remagen itself, killing German civilians who had refused or been unable to evacuate. 1 rocket splashed into the river. None came close to the bridge. Next came the Luftwaffe. In one of its final efforts in the west, German bombers clawed through dense curtains of American anti-aircraft fire. A few broke through and dropped their payloads. Explosions tore at the riverbanks. 1 bomb struck the bridge deck, gouging a crater, but the Ludendorff remained standing. American engineers worked through the night, reinforcing beams, welding plates, installing fresh timbers. Every hour the bridge survived, the foothold grew stronger. Hitler's final measure seemed almost medieval. He ordered combat swimmers, German frogmen, to infiltrate the Rhine at night with explosives strapped to their chests, hoping to attach charges to the bridge's stone piers beneath the surface. American searchlights sliced across the black water. Machine guns chattered into darkness. Grenades splashed in violent bursts, sending columns of water skyward. One by one, the swimmers disappeared. Some were killed in the water, some washed ashore wounded or unconscious. A few were captured, shivering and exhausted, dragged from the riverbank with their explosives still strapped on. None reached the piers. None inflicted meaningful damage. The bridge still stood. In Berlin, the news fed Hitler's fury. He fixated on the Ludendorff as though it were a personal insult carved into German landscape. To him, Remagen wasn't simply a tactical disaster, it was the embodiment of everything he believed had gone wrong. The German people had failed him. His generals had betrayed him. His officers had collapsed in cowardice. And now a single intact bridge had become the pathway through which the Allies would march into his empire. The court-martial convened on March 9th, just 2 days after Americans seized the bridge. Calling it a trial was generous. The outcome had been decided before the first witness spoke. Major Hans Skeller, charged with overseeing demolition, was found guilty of treason and cowardice. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, guilty. Major Herbert Strobel, guilty. Captain Willy Brach, despite commanding the defense, was also condemned, though his execution was delayed and ultimately never carried out. Skeller, Peters, and Strobel were taken to a nearby forest. Their death sentences were carried out immediately, cold, quiet shots among the trees. Their bodies fell not far from the river they had failed to deny the enemy. The killings changed nothing. By March 10th, American troops controlled all of Remagen and the heights overlooking the town. By March 11th, they had pushed 5 kilometers beyond the river. By March 12th, 2 full divisions were across the Rhine. American engineers weren't waiting. They began constructing pontoon bridges, long, floating spans that bobbed with the current. These new crossings multiplied the flow of men, tanks, and supplies. Even if the Ludendorff fell, the foothold was now permanent. And fall it would. On March 17th, 10 days after Sergeant Alex Drabik first raced across it, the wounded bridge finally surrendered. The accumulated damage, the flawed demolition, the weight of constant traffic, the relentless pounding of artillery and bombs proved too much. With a deep groaning crack that echoed across the valley, the central span lurched downward. Then the structure gave way entirely. A massive roar rolled across the water as steel and timber crashed into the Rhine. The river swallowed the remains in seconds. 28 American engineers working on repairs were killed. Dozens more were injured. But strategically, it no longer mattered. Multiple pontoon bridges were already operating. The Americans had crossed in strength 15 divisions by mid-March. The gateway into Germany stood wide open. When news of the collapse reached Berlin, Hitler received it with bitter satisfaction. The bridge was gone. But it had fallen 10 days too late to save Germany. Still, he continued issuing orders. Counterattacks that could not be mounted. Defensive lines manned by divisions that no longer existed. Requests for miracle weapons that were nothing more than sketches. Demands for tanks with no fuel and aircraft with no pilots. His staff dutifully nodded, took notes, and quietly disregarded the impossible commands. They all knew the truth. The war was beyond rescue. The bridgehead at Remagen was only one of several crossings the Allies made that month. To the south, Patton crossed at Oppenheim on March 22nd. To the north, Montgomery launched Operation Plunger on March 23rd. Soon Allied armies were racing deep into Germany, meeting only scattered resistance. What remained of the German army was collapsing. Tens of thousands surrendered. Others simply slipped away and walked home. But in the bunker beneath Berlin, Hitler never released his grip on Remagen. As Soviet artillery shook the ground above and the walls cracked under pressure, he ranted about the bridge again and again. In his fevered monologues, he circled back to the same grievances. The bridge, the officers who failed, the betrayal, the cowardice. He insisted he had given everything to Germany and the nation had failed him in return. He never once acknowledged his own responsibility. Never admitted that Remagen fell because Germany had been bled dry by doomed offensives, because the war had been lost long before an American ever set foot on the Rhine. He never recognized that the officers executed in the forest had done all they could in a hopeless situation. As the world he built crumbled around him, the Ludendorff Bridge remained one of the obsessions that haunted him to the end. For the men who took the bridge, life didn't freeze in that moment of glory. It moved forward quietly, unevenly, in ways they never could have predicted. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman received the Distinguished Service Cross for leading the assault. Sergeant Alex Drabik, the first American to cross the swaying span, received the same honor. Company of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion earned a Presidential Unit Citation for what many historians would later describe as one of the most consequential actions of the Western Front, but medals didn't shield them from what followed. Timmerman continued fighting across Germany until late April. He made it home but died in 1951 of a brain tumor at only 28 years old. Some who knew him said the war had burned him out from inside. Others called it chance, the cruel lottery of life. Drabik returned to Ohio, found work in a butcher shop, and slipped back into civilian rhythms. He rarely spoke of Remagen. When journalists asked what it felt like to be the first man across the Rhine, he simply shrugged. I was just doing my job. Any of the guys could have been first. The Ludendorff Bridge was never rebuilt. Its stone towers, scarred, empty, silent still, stand on both banks of the Rhine, preserved as a memorial. Inside one of them, a small museum tells the story of those 10 days when a damaged steel span became the most valuable piece of real estate in Europe. Visitors walk past photographs of the bridge crowded with American engineers and soldiers. They see images of its final collapse, the center span folding into the river. They see the pontoon bridges the army threw across in its place and the unstoppable flood of men in armor that followed. Yet the museum can only show so much. It cannot convey the panic that swept through Hitler's bunker as the news spread. It cannot recreate the madness of his orders or the desperation of his counterattacks. It cannot capture the fear of young Americans who sprinted across a structure that might have detonated beneath their feet at any moment, nor the relief that washed over them when they reached the far side alive. Historians estimate that the crossing at Remagen shortened the war in Europe by weeks, perhaps months. In 1945, every day mattered. Every day saved meant thousands of soldiers who would live to see home. Every day saved meant concentration camps liberated sooner. Fewer cities burned, fewer civilians killed in the final spasms of a dying regime. Remagen was not the decisive battle of World War II, but it was a decisive moment, an unmistakable signal that the end was inevitable. When Hitler learned of the bridge's capture, beneath his fury something else flickered, something he would never admit aloud. Recognition. A realization that the fall of the Ludendorff was the first crack in the final wall, protecting his empire. The Rhine had been crossed. The last natural barrier had been breached. From that moment forward, Germany was living on borrowed time. In the days that followed, German soldiers began surrendering in staggering numbers. They were not simply beaten but psychologically broken. The Rhine had always been more than a river. It was a lime in the German imagination, a symbol of security. Now the Americans had crossed it and held their bridgehead against everything Germany could throw at them. They had shown that the war was no longer a question of strategy but of endurance, and Germany had none left. To many German soldiers, surrender meant survival. A slim chance to see their families again, a chance denied to those who kept fighting. Hitler never understood this. He never understood that Remagen fell not because his officers betrayed him, but because Germany had exhausted the tools of modern war fuel, ammunition, tanks, trained men. He never grasped that rage could not replace resources, that threats could not replace divisions, that executions could not rebuild an army collapsing on every front. On April 30th, 1945, less than 8 weeks after American troops charged across the Rhine at Remagen, Adolf Hitler took his own life in the bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin. Soviet troops were within blocks of the Reich Chancellery. 8 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich, promised to last 1,000 years, had survived just 12. The Ludendorff Bridge had stood for only 10 of those final days. But in those 10 days, it shaped the end of a continent-wide war, helped hasten the liberation of millions, and broke through not only a river barrier but the psychological wall that had kept Germany fighting. It did not win the war, but it changed how quickly the world could begin to heal.